When the Supreme Court decided Marbury versus Madison in 1803, it claimed for itself the power to decide whether acts of Congress were constitutional. That moment is often described as the birth of judicial review. But what was presented as a modest act of logic? The Constitution is the supreme law, and judges must follow it, quietly turned into a transfer of power. The court made itself the final judge of what the Constitution means. Over time, this power reshaped the whole government. The idea sounds harmless enough. Of course, laws should follow the Constitution. But once a single group, unelected, life-tenured and unaccountable, claims the last word, everyone else begins to act differently. Legislators grow careless. Presidents grow deferential. Citizens grow accustomed to thinking that only judges can say what the Constitution means. What began as a court case about a commission became the foundation of a new political order. Today we follow that story in steps, tracing how one small habit or assumption reinforced another, until judicial supremacy became both natural and unquestioned. When the court first claimed the right to strike down laws, it took pressure off lawmakers. If the judges will clean up any constitutional mess, why worry too much about making one? Over time, Congress and state legislatures stopped checking their own work. They passed vague or conflicting laws and trusted the courts to interpret them into sense. That habit made the court less a referee and more a co-author of policy. Each time judges fixed a flawed statute, their own role as policymakers just deepened. The more they did it, the more natural it seemed. Judicial review, instead of being an emergency brake, became part of the vehicle's steering system. Once the court's opinions were treated as final and binding on everyone, the other branches began to defer automatically. Presidents and members of Congress stopped insisting on their own duty to interpret the Constitution. They acted as if the court alone could say what the document meant. That deference taught the public to believe the same thing. Over generations, people came to assume that the Constitution means whatever the Supreme Court says it means. This circular belief, judicial supremacy sustained by faith in judicial finality, became self-reinforcing. The court's authority was accepted because everyone had learned to accept it. Nothing in the Constitution actually grants the court this power. The document is silent about judicial review. Early justices filled that silence with what they called structural reasoning. If the Constitution is supreme and judges swear to uphold it, then they must be able to disregard unconstitutional laws. That inference seemed reasonable until it was treated as a proof. Once the court began using that logic, its decisions themselves became precedent. What began as a gap filled by interpretation hardened into the way things are. The longer the practice continued, the more legitimate it seemed. Precedent retroactively justified the original leap. The Constitution originally gave the judiciary power mainly over disputes between parties, especially between states. But once the court stood at that crossroads, it began to treat conflicts among laws themselves as disputes it could decide: state law versus federal law, or statute versus constitution. That shift changed the court from a neutral umpire into a kind of constitutional architect. It no longer just resolved quarrels, it shaped the structure those quarrels occurred within. What began as an instrument of balance became an engine of design. As judicial review became the standard safeguard, lawmakers began to externalize accountability. They no longer felt responsible for judging the constitutionality of their own acts. Instead, they passed controversial or even dubious measures and left it to the court to sort them out later. This behavior tied together two habits: relying on the court and avoiding responsibility. The more legislators deferred, the more indispensable the court seemed, and the more indispensable it seemed, the more legislators deferred. Accountability migrated from the political branches to the judiciary. The Constitution's original design gave the judiciary a limited role, focused on resolving concrete disputes. But that design just faded quietly as political leaders and citizens alike accepted the court's expansion. The new order, the so-called empire of law born from Marbury, looked stable and dignified. Because it worked smoothly, people just assumed it must be right. In that harmony lies the danger. When acceptance and apparent stability reinforce each other, the original limits fall into forgetfulness. What began as an exception becomes the rule, and soon, no one even remembers it was ever different. Once the court's supremacy was beyond challenge, lawmakers became even more careless. They could always rely on the judiciary to rewrite or strike down anything that went too far. Each round of legislative sloppiness forced the court to dig deeper into policymaking, which in turn made its original power grab seem both necessary and permanent. What began as one act of overreach became a self-sustaining system. The so-called coup of Marbury, a transfer of constitutional finality from the people's branches to the judicial one, became just too woven into daily government to undo easily. No amendment ever actually ratified judicial supremacy. The people never directly consented to it, yet it endures, justified by nothing more than time and habit. Because the system has lasted, its defenders call it legitimate. Continuity becomes its own excuse. Marbury versus Madison was wrongly decided not because it misread a clause, but because it rearranged the balance of self-government. It turned the Constitution from a living agreement among the people and their representatives into a managed code interpreted by a priesthood of judges. The founders gave us 3 branches so that each would keep the others honest. When one branch becomes the final judge of all, the others stop judging. Responsibility dissolves upward. What remains is a government of spectators waiting for the court to decide what the Constitution really means. If Marbury versus Madison quietly centralized constitutional meaning in one court, then the natural place to begin restoring balance is where that meaning once lived, in the states. The Constitution did not create the states created the Constitution. Their consent formed the federal government, and their continuing consent sustains it. So the question is not whether the United States Supreme Court has authority over federal courts. Of course it does, that's its proper sphere. The question is whether state courts, created by their own constitutions and answerable to their own people, must forever treat federal judicial opinions as binding rules of thought. Nothing in the text of the Constitution requires this. The Supremacy Clause makes the Constitution itself and the laws made in pursuance thereof supreme, not the opinions of federal judges. When a state Supreme Court interprets the same Constitution, it is reading the same text, not defying it. The binding precedent theory is not written law, it's a professional custom. A single state Supreme Court could alter this balance, not through defiance, but through reasoning. It could say, in a case involving a federal question, while we respect the views of the US Supreme Court, we are not bound by its interpretations, which are opinions of another court, not the Constitution itself. Our duty, under our oath, is to interpret that Constitution directly. That single articulation would reopen a space of constitutional dialogue. The people of that state would not be seceding, nullifying, or rebelling. Their judges would simply be fulfilling their own oaths of office, to the same Constitution the federal judges claim to uphold. If other states followed, the question would naturally return to the national level. Is uniformity of interpretation more important than the diversity of consent? That's the very question the founders left open for the people themselves to decide, not the courts. Once that happens, the next move is not coercion but choice. The national government could accept this pluralism as part of the constitutional design, recognizing that a living federalism includes disagreement, or it could seek to clarify the question through a constitutional convention, the mechanism the founders provided for peaceful recalibration. If the states act and the nation consents by inaction, that silence itself is a form of ratification, a quiet rebalancing of interpretive power back toward the distributed sovereignty that once defined the republic. If the nation calls a convention, then at last the people will speak directly, and the question of judicial supremacy will meet the only test it ever lacked: explicit consent. The court cannot unmake the people who made the Constitution. The states, each with its own Supreme Court, remain the living memory of that sovereignty. They have obeyed Marbury out of habit, not law. To stop doing so would not break the Union. It would remind it of how it was formed. A rebalancing, then, does not require revolt. It requires remembering that consent, not precedent, is the highest law,